Hi everyone. Just a really quick introduction just to orient you to what we're going to do in this particular module. We're going to be focused firstly on a film and then mainly around that. That's the activities are really going to center around Nisha Pahuja's film, The World Before Her. I'm not going to say very much about that here. I'll let that unfold for you as it moves along and as you go to it. I want you to go to it pretty quickly. What the idea of this film is to present you with a case study for us to think about this question that's been popping up from time to time, and that is a key one in any kind of consideration of a changing world, a globalizing world, if we want to keep focus there, but very much this sort of changing world that, and it's difficult not to see globalization as a part of that. What I want to focus here on is the question about homogenization, heterogenization. I want to introduce another term, throw another term into this to see what that can do to help us think our way through this, complicate matters as well, no question about that. The term is hybridity. And if you stop and think about that term, hybridity, it's worth just unpacking that as you understand it to see what it means. Often it has more of a biological connotation than a cultural one. If we start to apply that biological metaphor into the cultural domains, what might it allow us to do? What might it allow us to think about and think with in regards to that? And there'll be a key article about picking up on that particular idea. And all the time through this, as we interrogate the notion of homogeneity, heterogeneity, hybridity, we're going to be using the film as a way of seeing what that allows us to do, allows us to understand about broader social change. As you may have noticed from last week, what we're starting to do now is looking at particular case studies to look at local responses, local reactions, local practices, to see what they can tell us about bigger, broader changes. Now, I just want to share though a few thoughts with you. So I'm going to go to a PowerPoint now. And what I want to just talk about here is the notion of the term culture. So let me just put this on. So when you hear the word culture, what comes to mind for you? What do you think about? Now, if you're listening to this video, this might be the moment just to pause it. If you are watching the video, how could you be doing anything else? But anyway, let's pause the video for a few minutes. If you're using a journal is really what I was trying to get at. You might use this as a moment just to stop and ponder that for a moment. What's your understanding of the term? What comes to mind for you? What kind of images or what kind of ideas, thoughts flow towards you? Assuming that they do in some ways. Michael Vesh, who you read last week, with regards to globalization and underdevelopment and so on, makes the point in his chapter on culture. The culture is like water to us. And he uses, as a preface to this, the story of two young fish swimming in the water, meeting an old timer who comes up and asks the question, "So, how's the water for you today?" And then off he swims. And the two young guys kind of look at each other, swimming along for a bit longer. And one of them turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" We're so immersed in our own ideas and assumptions, we can't see them. It can be useful to jump out now and then to get a new perspective on things. So the great virtues of encountering someone or some place that's radically different from what we know. And in that we can see the contrast between how we do things and how they do things. And we can then see ourselves in a new light. We can perhaps see ourselves for the first time, some would argue, with regards to that. So culture is like water to us. And I would want to put to you that if we didn't have the concept, it's one of those that we would have to invent. It seems to me to be attempting to capture a characteristic of the human species, the ability to learn what is there and to transform what is there. Now, that is something that the neurobiologists are really starting to point out. That the difference for us as a species is whilst other animals can acquire a culture, they learn how to manipulate tools in their environment, basically from their community around them, their parents and so on, but community around them. What they don't really have at the same level that human beings have is an ability to transform what's there and for that to become an immediate part of the heritage of the next generation or the next lot of offspring that come along. Generations get us thinking in little blocks about how people come on the scene, and it's nowhere near as straightforward as that. It's also attempting to capture some sort of collective orientation to the world that's related to the time and place in which people are located. So when we think about it temporally in terms of time, we see the world differently to our ancestors 200 years ago, and of course incredibly different to how it was 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, and so on. And then there's something about growing up in particular places that give us particular views on the world. And so that's what the culture concept is attempting to capture. It does involve us thinking statistically. So we're talking about general characteristics shared by most people, that kind of thinking. We're certainly not trying to claim that everybody sees the world this way, although there may be some characteristics where that's the case, in some perhaps smaller collectives. Accepting that it's an essentially contested concept is something else that I'm inviting you to embrace here. How one wishes to use the concept of culture depends upon one's orientation to the social world. Now, I hope this is going to become clearer through not so much what you'll see in the movie, but in what you experience in analysing it yourself and talking about it with others, but also in some of the readings that we're going to do. Particularly later from a fellow by the name of Peterson, writing about the notion of hybridity. Now, just to orient you to this, and just to let you know that this is tricky stuff. Culture has been declared to be one of the 3 most difficult words in the English language. Now, I don't know how these things get calculated at all, but certainly a couple of sociolinguists have been pointing to that. There are myriad definitions, thousands of them. And there is great contestation over its use. And especially, I would suggest, among anthropologists, remembering, of course, that it is a keystone idea in anthropology in ways that it probably isn't in any other discipline. Cultural studies would be different, and there'd be different inflections from there. If you want to read around it, Abu Lude's paper of quite some years ago now, Writing Against Culture, is worth a look, and then the debates that ensued from that. In one of the texts I was reading, and curiously, I could not get a reference for it. Theoretical debates about the meaning that should be attributed to the concept of culture are pointless. There is no absolute reason why one abstract theoretical concept of it should be better than another. When you see so many, that's what it comes down to. When there are so many, how do you choose some? I'll give you a couple. I'll give you one that I think is probably worth using at this particular point in time and in this stage of your thinking about this, but just keep bearing in mind it's one definition among many. One of the things, or two of the things we need to address are the problems of reification and essentialism. So if we think about these, to reify is to convert a person or an abstract concept into a thing. I think I've already talked about that in relation to the economy, but I'm also thinking that we need to be applying this to the notion of culture. It is an abstract concept. It is it's a tool of thought, as I've suggested before, not an eternal truth. And there is a tendency to talk about the culture, a culture. People do this because of culture, which then gives us the notion of culture as property. People either have it or they don't, or if it can come across in that way. Culture as contents or containers, bounded things that can be listed and enumerated, a kind of checklist of what it means to belong to a particular culture. The notion of essentialism is the belief that all people in a social group or culture are fundamentally the same. And we know that it's nowhere near as straightforward as that. Just reminding you again about this idea about the importance of thinking statistically about what's going on. So what is this thing called culture? Well, Tyler, way back, an ancient echo, argued that it's that complex whole which included knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man. We'll forgive him the exclusive language from back there, as a member of society. A far more recent rendering that I quite like, I've always liked this particular one for its simplicity, and I think it captures the main parts of this. we've got sets of learned behavior and ideas that human beings acquire as members of a society. Human beings use culture to adapt to and transform the world in which we live. So key idea, learned behavior and ideas that we acquire as a consequence of being born in a particular place, particular time. Of course, just because we're born into a particular place doesn't mean we stay there, and they're all parts of the complexities of thinking about this culture concept. And we use it to transform the world and adapt to it. And to be part of it would be another element I'd want to add. Kotak, another textbook writer, suggests that culture is learned, shared, symbolic, all-encompassing. You can see here a bit of a checklist that I think is useful enough, that it's integrated, that people get integrated into it, and it is an integrated part of a society, used actively, and it's both adaptive and maladaptive. It doesn't necessarily just produce good things. Common sense ideas that have a certain hold on people aren't necessarily helpful in adapting to new worlds and what's coming on. And it's interesting then to just juxtaposition that next to Tyler's ancient echo, the ancient echo from Tyler about that complex whole. I think Kotek's idea is picking up similar things. I just want to finish by reflecting on the ability for culture to become difference-making. There is a real tendency to think about culture as unique and to be looking for the unique features of a culture. So if we start to think about national cultures, what we would want to do when thinking about Australian culture is pick off what's different rather than what's common with other places. Or if we are willing to acknowledge the commonalities, we're also quite likely, but we're likely at the same time to be wanting to find the points of difference. And of course, it's not necessarily a valid or a useful way to approach things. I'll talk more about this at a future module. But Kahn, way back in '91, made this point that the idea of cultural diversity can become just another way in which elites choose to construct people as different. And this continued 19th century focus on human difference, whether it's perceived in racial or cultural terms, can have some very disturbing effects. I'm going to return to this idea in a video lecture I'm going to give at the very end of this module, because I think there's some important points to be made there, points that Peterson certainly draws out in his paper on cultural hybridity. So there's some thoughts to begin with. What I invite you to do right now is just stop for a moment, have a think about this culture concept, just review some of the ideas that are coming through here, and just then carry that forward into your watching of the film, which will be the next thing that we invite you to do. And I think you'll find the world before her quite stimulating, disturbing in many ways, intriguing as well, all at the same time. Go well with that, and I'll catch you at the other end of the module.